Hello, hello. I'm assuming I'm live. If you are out there and you can't hear me, let me know. Well, it's Friday afternoon, and I have finally finished not only the first draft, but the polishes that I do, the edits, the internal edits for my latest book, and also the acknowledgements and the historical note, or the author's note as I've called it, where I've sort of compiled, as I always do with my historical novels, a list of, or a description of some of the historical contexts and where I've taken liberties and things like that in the book. And whilst doing that, of course, I had to go back and look at the research books that I've been using while writing this book. So I thought, as I've finished everything now and I'm feeling happy and it's Friday, the end of the week, I thought I would just share some of those books with you and talk a little bit more about this current book that I've written. I'm feeling a bit better about it. I always feel terrified when it gets to this stage and you've just finished a book. I think most writers feel the same way. Very few, well, basically it's only I've read it at this point, and one beta reader, one of my best friends, who's read all of my books. He's read it, and he's already said that he's enjoyed it. So I've started to feel a little bit more relaxed because I've got one thumbs up from my friend. But so far, only 2 people in the whole world have read this book, and so it's quite nerve-wracking at that stage. I think all writers feel the same way, that you start questioning whether you've just written a whole load of rubbish and it's going to be awful. But anyway, I'm starting to feel a little bit better about it, but I definitely feel better about the fact that I've got over those milestones and I can sort of take a bit of a breath, a bit of a breather. And if you've been following any of my posts recently on Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else, or my Patreon, or if you've been listening to Rock Paper Swords, the podcast that I co-host with Stephen A. Mackay, you'll know that the current book that I'm talking about, the one I've just finished working on, is totally new for me. It's set in a totally different place. It's set at the end of the 19th century, and it's set in America. So it's a very different kettle of fish than you're used to if you've been reading my books. But saying that, I think all of my books essentially are very similar in theme and sort of the general plotting and sort of feel of them. Even if it's in a different time period, I think there's many things about it that will resonate with you if you've enjoyed my other books. It has a heroic but damaged protagonist who seeks to right injustices that he finds along the way, and inevitably there's quite a lot of action and adventure, and not only is he a bit angst filled and damaged by his past, he's also yearning for a better future. And I think there's lots of things there that I tend to always end up gravitating towards when I'm writing. And so it may be set in a different time and place, but I think there's a lot that you'll recognise from my other books, and hopefully you'll come with me on this journey. I've actually really enjoyed it. I've been very nervous whilst going through the actual writing process, and I'm still worried about the reception it's going to get, because it's very different to my other books in terms of at least the sort of superficial feel of it. That it looks, I think the feel of it is really similar, but I think the superficial packaging of the story is different, and so I think depending on how it's presented, it could, I guess some people might not want to pick it up and read it. I'm hoping that people will give it a shot and give it a chance, because I actually think it's pretty good now that I've finished it, and I'm starting to feel more relaxed about it. But anyway, I thought I'd share, as I said, some of the books that I've been using recently, and especially over the last couple of weeks as I've been sort of polishing up this historical note. I mean, if you haven't worked out by now, the book is actually set in on the west coast of America in 1890. So I've been using books like this, The Dictionary of the American West. This is an interesting little book. I turn to it from time to time. It's just, literally a dictionary of terms and things. So it's a bit of a weird one though, because it doesn't have the modern term. It has old-fashioned terms from the 19th century. So if you don't actually know the term you're looking for, which is one of the things I found with this writing this period, it's quite difficult. Sometimes you think this is I know the modern word for something, but what's the old word for it? And there's no way of. It's very very difficult to do that sort of look back from the modern to the old. You can find the old, if you know the old words, you can find out what it means. But there's quite a few sort of dictionaries things. But that's one thing I've used, and it's been quite useful because sometimes just flipping through it. Or flicking through it, you'll find something and think, I can use that. So especially in some of the dialogue, using some of the terms that come up there. And another book that I've used, especially for dialogue, quite a bit, is a similar one, but this one here, Frontier Slang, Lingo and Phrases, by Kathy Weiser Alexander, or Weiser, I don't know how you pronounce her surname. But yeah, so this is similar, I think sort of independently published book. I actually found the same thing of this Legends of America, I think, are the publishers. I actually found the same thing, this whole thing online. I think they've taken this from their online resource and then made a book out of it. And the online resource, of course, is searchable, so it's much more useful. So although I bought the book, I ended up going to the online page, and there I could do a Control F and find things. So that was quite useful. So again, for the dialogue, that was helpful. It's quite helpful to obviously have read lots of books set in that time period, and watched movies as well, and sort of lift ideas and the way people speak from those things as well. Hopefully not straying in too much into stereotype, but keeping things interesting. The very beta reader that I mentioned earlier, who's read the book and enjoyed it, is a fan of my books, but he's also a fan of Westerns and this time period. So he bought me this book a few years, or a couple of years ago, The Writer's Guide to Everyday Life in the Wild West. This is a sort of a running theme. He's known for a while that I've been talking about writing a Western, and we share a love of Westerns. And I'm very reticent to actually call the book that I've written a Western, although I think it sort of is. But I think Westerns have got quite a sort of negative perception of them, at least with many people. I think there's a certain type of people think they're hackneyed and sort of pulp fiction, and there's something that some people dislike about them. When really it's just what I've written is just historical fiction that happens to be set in the 19th century in a western along the western frontier of the United States. So it's really historical fiction. It's not the fact that it's set in the west of America. I don't really think the genre should necessarily be Western. I think it's historical fiction. As he described it, this friend of mine, he's messaged me and said that he really enjoyed it, and he said it's a Western with a noir twist. So it's definitely not your sort of standard Western that you'd expect, maybe. Although it's got elements of that, I suppose. So this book by Candy Moulton he bought for me, and that's useful as well. And it's broken down into large areas. So it's things like land ownership, Western wars, clothes and accessories, furnishing a home, architecture, marriage, dentist and medicine, employment. So it's got also these different things, and it talks about how much things cost and different things like that. So it's very useful from the sort of the nitty-gritty that a writer needs when you're writing about a period, but things that are sometimes quite difficult to find, even though the internet has got a plethora of information about pretty much anything. But yeah, useful. And if anyone's thinking of writing a book, there's other books similar to this, like there's Everyday Life in Victorian England and things like that. There's different ones that are probably equally as useful if you're writing different places or times. Another book just reminded me. There's another book here that actually this is 3 or 4 years ago. The same friend bought me this for Christmas. It's the American Cowboy Photographic History, and these are original photos from ranches in the late 19th century. This is 1895. And these are working ranches and real photos from 1908, so sort of from the turn of that century. And it's a really interesting book, but I found this the other day. This was sort of inspirational, I guess. I was looking through this for inspiration. But he's written in the book, he's written, "To Matthew, Merry Christmas. Some inspiration for the next novel?" ? So this has long been, I think he's basically forced me, my friend Gareth has basically forced me into writing the Western eventually. And luckily, when I pushed to do it to my editor, he sort of said, yeah, okay, why not? Go for it. So thankfully, my editors agreed. And I hope you'll be pleased with that decision. My book's set in 1890, and it's at a time when the railroads are just connected quite recently. Before then, the west and the east coasts of America, effectively shrinking North America, because before it took months to travel from one coast to the other. And after the train tracks were joined, I can't remember the exact year, but after they were joined in the second half of the 1800s, you could travel from New York to San Francisco in 4 or 5 days or something at that point. It's still a long journey, but suddenly what took weeks and even months before was suddenly reduced down to just days. So it really made the United States into a single country that you could rule and control from central points. So yes, this is a book that was interesting. I'm not really much of a train nerd, but I did need to look at the maps and understand how things evolved. And by 1890, as I say, the big sort of transcontinental east to west coast, Atlantic to Pacific tracks had been laid, but there were still lots more tracks being laid, because America is a huge place, as you know. And where the book is set in Oregon, some of the tracks were still being laid, and so I've got, part of the storyline is about the arrival of the railroad to the town. So that was useful. This next book's an interesting one. You can't actually see what it is. Looks pretty. Look at that, nicely bound. Atlas of the Historical Geography of the United States. Now this is a weird one, because when I was researching, it must be back in January or something, I found this online, and it's actually printed and bound in India. So I ordered it, not realizing that what it was effectively is an old book that's out of print. Well, I realized that, but what they've done is 1932 American Geographical Society of New York and the Carnegie Institution of Washington have this. I'm guessing it was probably bigger originally. I think it's probably twice the size, really big book. And basically they've done like a print on demand. They printed it and then bound it in leather. It's all very nice. I mean, it looks lovely. How much use is it? I don't know. Look at the size of the text. I mean, it's you can just about read it. You probably need a microscope, not microscope, but a magnifying glass if you're going to read. If you're going to read it for long, I think you do your head in just reading a lot of very small text. And the main problem I had with this was that although the maps look very interesting and there's lots of historical maps, they must have been bigger originally, and being reproduced in black and white, they lose so much of the definition that they become almost impossible to really follow. So it's a bit disappointing, especially when they look really useful. Some of them you sort of think, wow, these look great, but yeah, lots of maps, but how much use this really was. It wasn't vastly expensive, but it was a bit annoying when I got it, because I thought, and also it took about 2 months to arrive, because this obviously, the order arrived, I paid for it via PayPal, and then waited, I think, about 2 or 3 months, and then this came through. I'd already, was halfway through writing the book by the time it came. And I know that's what things used to be like, but nowadays we're kind of used to doing things and getting them the next day. If I order something on Amazon, I get it the next day or maybe the day after. Anyway, it was an interesting one, and I've got it now for my bookshelf. And maybe it will be useful at some point. A more useful atlas that I used was the Historical Atlas of the American West, and this one is much more modern, but it's presented in a much more focused way, more sort of from the historian perspective. So you've got things like the buffalo herds, and it's just got a map you see here all about how the buffalo herds were at certain years, how big they were, where they went, and it's got all different sort of, basically each double page you've got the native tribal areas here and then a description. So each part of it is like that. Barriers to the west, and it talks about different mountain ranges and deserts and descriptions here. So that was really useful. And again, it's got things like the Oregon California Trail. So the trail that people followed, the Oregon Trail that people followed across into Oregon, and then would branch either up into Oregon or down into California. So this is a University of Oklahoma Press book. And I don't know where I got that second hand, but useful anyway. Found that online somewhere and got that, and that's been used quite a bit. I haven't read this one cover to cover. Well, I've not read any of the ones I've said cover to cover, but this one's useful if you want to know about the plight of the Native Americans. It's actually heartbreaking. I mean, I read some of this just yesterday. I was writing up a bit of the author's note and wanted to get some specific details, some specific dates. And this, I read a chapter towards the end of this book, and the Peter Cousins, The Earth is Weeping, the epic story of the Indian Wars for the American West. And this is quite a modern book. There's obviously a very famous seminal book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was I think the first book, or at least the first major book that I know of, that kind of tried to redress the balance of of what had happened to the Native Americans, and that was written I think sometime in the 70s, maybe early 70s, and with that there was like a resurgence then of different films and books taking the side of the North American Native American Indians, the Native Americans. Whereas before then, of course, most films and books have been very much it's the white Anglos against the Native Americans. So it was a really interesting point in history, trying to redress the balance. But yeah, as I say, the history of the and maybe I think reading a little bit of this, I think this is sort of trying to become more balanced, whereas the Bury My Heart, Wounded Knee is very much pro Native American and incredibly anti settlers and the expansion and the treatment of the Native Americans. This book tries to be more balanced, but however balanced it tries to be, reading about how the Native Americans are treated and just thinking of the destruction of their homeland and their way of life is actually it's heartbreaking. So if you want a sobering read that. If you're interested in the history of the American West. So I realise there's no comments. Nobody's commented. I see there's a few people watching. Nobody, as far as I can see, has commented. But if you've got any questions, drop them into the comments. And if you've got any questions about other things, other books, I've got, of course, in September I've got the third of the Hunlaf books, the third of the Time for Swords series, A Day of Reckoning. It's coming out on the 28th of September. So if you've got any questions about that or anything else, then give us a shout. But I just thought I'd talk about this while I've got these things fresh in my mind. Of course, being set in 1890 in the west of America, I had to have at least one book about guns and weapons and stuff, and this one was recommended to me, and it's pretty damn good. and it's got spreads like this where it talks all about the different weapons of the time. Very interesting. Gives a good sort of high level grounding. I find those sort of spreads of photos incredibly useful, just for getting an idea of the scale of things, the size of guns, and how many there were. So yeah, very useful book. I think out of print now, but is easily available online. I've got that. So it's called The Taming of the West, Age of the Gunfighter, Men and Weapons of the Frontier, 1840 to 1900, Joseph G. Rosa, with artifacts from the Gene Autry Western Heritage Museum and the Buffalo Bill Historical Center. So yeah, that was really, really useful. That was recommended to me, I think, by Richard Smith, who's a guy that I spoke to online, and then he invited me along to see some of the guns that he and his colleagues in a Western shooting club in the UK have. So that was great. So that was really useful, and so he recommended the book, and then I went along and actually saw some of the guns in real life, shot them and got to hold them, and that was really, really informative. A couple of comments. Dean Hamilton recommending Empire of the Summer Moon by C.S. Gwynne, or S.C. Gwynne, sorry. It's about the rise and fall of the Comanches. Oh, that sounds good. Sounds good. Sounds probably incredibly depressing, but yeah, sounds great. I've not read it, so yeah, maybe I'll look that up actually. And Steve Literal, who's been really useful. I'm not sure how you pronounce your surname, so Literal. Yeah, I'm going to say Literal. So yeah, from Tennessee. Did you create a fictional town for your story, or did you use a real historic location? Aha, well, that's interesting in that I've based it in a real location in Oregon, more or less, but I decided, as Steve has alluded to, I decided that the town around which the action would take place, it sort of takes place in and around a town. I would actually make it a fictional town. So I've actually called it, the town is called Griffith, but it doesn't exist. There may be other towns in the States called Griffith, but there isn't one there. So it's in the Blue Mountains in Oregon, and it's really loosely based on the location of a town called Elgin. So there's a town called Elgin. I decided I wanted it in that location, and so it's loosely based on that. But I thought, rather than run the risk of everyone telling me, "Oh, it's not, you've got it wrong, and the street's not that way, and this isn't that bit, and the river's further away," or whatever the details are, I'd get wrong, because inevitably I would. I decided to create this fictional town and basically just plonk it in that sort of location. So yes, so apparently the pronunciation is literally literal, so good, just like the word. The family name is from Somerset. Well, it's very close to me, so actually about 10-15 minutes drive from Somerset, where I'm sitting right now. I'm in Wiltshire, but I can drive to Somerset very quickly. I could walk to Somerset. So some other books, back to the books. And if you've got more comments or questions, drop them in and I will answer. So yeah, other books I've got. This one here, The Great American West, Pursuing the American Dream, Kenneth W. Rendell, I don't know. Anyway, that was all right. Got some interesting photos, nice photos and stuff. Don't remember that being fantastically useful. What often happens with these sort of books is they're sort of very high level, so you read them and you don't really find out a lot. So I find the best ones are the ones that have the best photos, really. Often. This one's quite good. This was good. I think this might have been a gift as well. The Old West, Stephen G. Hislop, National Geographic one, and this sort of covers everything. And yeah, this is very nicely presented. There's a really annoying thing is when I I moved to the UK from Spain back in 2001, and when I lived in Spain during the 90s, so the late 80s and all through the 90s, I'd become a massive Western fan, and I got really into the whole thing of watching Western movies and reading Western novels and Louis L'Amour books and stuff. And I'd actually accumulated over those sort of 10 years lots and lots of those sort of books, these big sort of hardback books with photos. And I think that book about the gunslinger, the gunfighter book, I think I had that back then. I mean, I recognise it. I think I had this book then. And books like this, I had quite a few. And when we moved back to the UK, we didn't have much money and we couldn't afford to ship everything over. And so I got rid of all of my books. I'm just going to be a moment's silence there. Not just all of my Western books, but I had loads of role-playing game books. I kept a few of my role-playing games, ones, the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, but all the other role-playing games that I played, which I played basically every role-playing game that had come out for the last 20 years. And I'd bought the rules. I got rid of everything, so I lost all of the rule books for all of those different things. I had magazines that anyway, a moment's silence. Okay, moving on. It was very depressing. So another book here that's huge. I bought thinking that it would be useful, and it probably is, but I haven't used it as much as I'd expect. But the Encyclopedia of the American West, I'm sure at some point. I have used it a bit, but it's very, very dense, as you can see. It's hardly lifted. And I think if there's anyone that you want to find out anything about, it's got details about famous people and places, and so you look up anything in there, you'll get some information. I think the main problem with books like this now is that, of course, it's all available online. So although this is a great resource and it's nice to have the book, if I want to know, like if I just open this randomly at a page and see stuff about the railroad, I've got another book about a railroad. So if I find a person though, like Bernard Devoto, educator, novelist and historian, born 1897, right, and died in 1955. I have no idea who he is. But if I needed to know about him, I could easily, I'm pretty sure, Google it and find out all I needed to know. So I think that's the problem with these kind of books, encyclopedias. Really, the web has sort of taken over. Few other books that are not specifically about the West but do touch on the novel and will give you an idea about maybe other things about the novel. I've used this one quite a lot, The Memoirs of the 10th Royal Hussars, Prince of Wales' Own. That's the 10th Royal Prince of Wales' Own Hussars. So this book was actually written, this is obviously a reprint, but originally, I think it was written 1891. There you go, 1891, by Colonel R.S. Liddell, I guess. Late commanding of the 10th Royal Hussars. So this is a memoir of the Hussars. I guess as a retired colonel, he decided that he would write the memoir of this regiment, and that's been very useful. And a bit more, which will give you a bit more. So here, the Anglo-Afghan Wars. So you might imagine the history of the Anglo-Afghan Wars here. These took place, so the Second Anglo-Afghan War took place at the end of the 1870s and into the 1880s. Bearing in mind my book is set in 1890. And the 10th Royal Hussars were in Afghanistan at that time, at least for some of it. Again, another book here, The Savage Frontier, A History of the Anglo-Afghan Wars. So useful. This one's a little bit earlier. I've not used it as much, but I thought it might be useful. But and it has been useful a bit, but I'm not going into great detail. It's a bit too early, but still gives some interesting insights. Charging Against Napoleon, Diaries and Letters of Three Hussars. So that's quite interesting, actually getting the words of the actual officers themselves. I'm going to sneeze. I can feel a sneeze brewing. Oh. Beg my pardon. Oh. And then the this one as well, which you have to read the book to work out how all of these things link up. But yeah, this is a self-published book called Killed a Young Girl. It Was Fine and Hot. The Murder of Sweet F.A. And this is by Keith McCloskey. yeah, and this is about a horrific murder of a girl called Fanny Adams, which you may have heard the expression "Sweet Fanny Adams" or "Sweet FA." It comes from this girl murdered in 1867, and this talks all about the crime and other crimes associated with it or thought to be linked to it in different ways, and the investigation and what happened. And it's absolutely brutal and awful, and of course, when I think of sort of crime and murder in the 19th century in Britain, I think of Jack the Ripper and the horrible murders of prostitutes in London, Whitechapel, at the end of the 1880s. And this was a bit earlier, but absolutely atrocious, horrific crime. And there's some inspiration in there. Well, not inspiration, but inspiration for the book. And yeah, just, I mean, stomach turning stuff. So I read those sort of things, and I don't know, it just makes me question humanity, and also makes me always, when I read things like that or anything about historical crime, about how people always say that nowadays, you know, things are so much worse and people do terrible things and it never used to be like that. And you think, well, this was like 150 years ago, or 100, well, more, you know, 180 years ago or something, and people are doing just horrendous things. So I think there's always been evil and just horrific people. And often those are the very people that it's interesting to write about, or at least have them somehow appear in books, and the aftermath of their actions drive a story forward, or impact on the protagonist in some way. So that's a selection of the books. That's pretty much most of the books I've been using, and I've got a very, very long list of folders on my browser of all the different sites that I've been using to look up information. So yeah, that's it. So I've got, it looks like more people are joining now as I've shown all the books off. So if you missed me talking all about the books and whatever, you can obviously go back and watch the video from the beginning. But if you've got any questions, I'll stay around for a few minutes. Drop them in the comments. Any questions or comments? Have you read any? I mean, that Dean Hamilton has recommended a book about the rise and fall of the Comanches. Has anyone read any good novels set in the late 19th century, whether in America or other locations? Or have you got any good non-fiction books that you'd recommend? Because I'm always on the lookout. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just remind you that if you want sort of more in-depth and advanced behind-the-scenes stuff, then by all means check out my Patreon on patreon.com/Matthew Harvey, and I do sort of post advanced snippets of writing and even some completely unpublished. There's a couple of unpublished things on there. There's a whole novella and some short stories and things. So have a look on there if you're interested, and if not, don't bother, that's fine. And don't forget that every couple of weeks there's a new episode of Rock Paper Swords, the podcast that I co-host with Stephen A. Mackay. So make sure you check that out. If you haven't already checked it out, why not? But make sure you do, because it's really great, and we've had some brilliant guests on there. We've sometimes just me and Stephen talking about different history and things, or different books or films or whatever we're interested in, but more often than not we've got guests, and we've had just recently, like today, we've had Dr. Joanne Ball on there, a Roman battlefield archaeologist. Really interesting conversation. We've had famous rock stars from Jethro Tull. We've had Ian Anderson, who's sold more than 60 million albums. So we've had Bernard Cornwell on there. We've had Simon Scarrow, Dan Jones. So we've had some great historical writers. We've had historical fiction writers. We've got archaeologists. We've We've had musicians. We'll do our best to continue getting great guests on. We've got some brilliant guests lined up. So yeah, if you haven't already done so, have a look through the back catalogue. They're all free to listen to, and see what you think. And subscribe on whatever podcast listening app you've got, or if you prefer, they're all available on YouTube as well. So you can just subscribe on there, and you'll get notifications to when new episodes come out, and you can listen for free to all of those episodes. But yeah, if you've got any time, you want to listen to some interesting interviews, then check it out. So no more questions. No questions from anybody. I'm going to wrap it up, but I'm feeling great. It's really good. I've got it's really good to have that feeling of release, that I've got the book more, well, at least for this first stage, finished until the editors come back and tell me to make some changes. So I've got a question here from Chris Bailey, of who I think you just about see in the background the axe hanging up there on one of the bookshelves. So he made that for me for the cover of Wolf of Wessex. Hi Chris. So he says, hi Matthew, the Time Life books on the West were some of the best I ever read many years ago, but excellent. They were beautifully bound and consisted of, if I recall rightly, about 30 volumes. Blimey, wish I still had them. Oh yeah, I bet. Yes, unfortunately, like all of my books, I'm sure at some stage you gave them away or got rid of them when you moved house or something, and it's quite depressing when you look back and think, oh gosh, it's so difficult. Oh yeah, Steve Literal says, I have the brown leather set of Time Life books on the West. They're awesome. I have to actually give a shout out. You just reminded me, Steve Literal, that he sent me. Steve sent me lots of photos of his trip over from Tennessee through some of the western states a few weeks ago. So thanks very much, Steve. It was really, really great. So I have to actually add a little note to that effect to the acknowledgements, because it was very useful, and you sent me a few snippets of information. So thank you very much, Steve. Yeah, so I think that's about it from me. You're very welcome, Steve. So yeah, so whatever you're doing this weekend, I hope you have a good one, and maybe better than my wife's, where she's come down with COVID, but hopefully she's on the mend now. But yeah, it's been an interesting week because she's just been feeling grotty, and I've been banished out to my office, trying to avoid the lurgy. Oh, Chris, are you generally more interested in the later period? You mean the later period of the West? So can you say why? So if you mean the later period of the American West and the frontier, there's different reasons why in this book I chose to write about that time frame. Partly, I think, not to fall into the sort of the stereotypical Western. So I wanted to write a book that's set in the American West that's maybe slightly different, at least. So it's not set in the height of the gunslinger era, the 1870s, right in the middle of the Indian Wars and stuff like that. So a little bit later. I guess when I was thinking about it as well, I think probably books like Lonesome Dove really were kind of situated at the end of the American West, as well as something quite sad about that end of the period. But also, it's a time of great change again, and but some of the other reasons for it in the book is to sort of line up historically with where I wanted my main character to be. So the main character, he's actually English, and and he travels there. And I wanted him to have a specific type of background, and for him to have that background and to have been involved in specific things, and for it to be historically based in a historical time frame. Unless I wanted to make it completely fictional, but I wanted to sort of base it in reality. So things like the Second Afghan War took place at a certain time, so I needed to set it after things like that. So it was really lots to do with just being able to slot into a time frame. And then when I started looking into that period, I did find there were specific things that were going on from the mid 1880s onwards that changed the face of the American West. So things like, as we said, the railroad I said earlier, connecting places up more, and things like the introduction of big sheep farms, lots and lots of sheep, and so the sheep and cattle wars tended to be later, from really sort of 1880 something onwards. And so so those are some of the elements that I've picked up on in this book. So yeah, I'm not specifically only interested in the later period of the American West, but this book happened to sort of fall into that time frame once I started researching and writing. And once you sort of go down that rabbit hole, originally I thought it was going to probably be earlier, and I think I envisaged that the sort of the places and the time frame that I was going to be writing about was going to be more like some of those more traditional that more traditional Western period of maybe 15 years earlier. But as I progressed, I realised that actually there were certain things that happened a bit later that made things a bit different, a bit interesting. So I don't know if that answers your question. So, anything else from anyone else? I'll wait for a minute or two because I think sometimes the comments take a while to pop in. But yes, I'm hoping that, as I was saying before, I hope my wife recovers from the dreaded COVID, which she's got for the second time over this weekend, and that I'm sort of in two minds about whether I want to catch it or not. I've been kind of trying to avoid catching it, but at the same time, we are going away to the States actually in a couple of weeks, about 3 weeks, and so I'm thinking maybe it would be better to catch it now and then not catch it potentially whilst travelling, which could be pretty nasty. Okay, yeah, thanks, Chris. Glad that answered your question. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that crop up in that time period that it's just interesting when you start to actually research a very specific. Because once I can't speak for other writers, but as I started sort of thinking of the idea of writing in the American West, I just sort of had this general idea of this is what the West is in my mind based on all the books and films and things I've read and watched. And then once you start actually writing it, because you write because I'm write historical fiction, and I don't really want to write sort of a fantasy West. You have to start drilling down and thinking, right, so what was there available? What sort of things, what weapons were available? What things had happened in that year? And you have to start really investigating real specifics. And what then happens is you realise that because you have to choose a place, you choose that time and place, and then threads start coming out which actually start to inform the story that you're writing. So you've already got this sort of general idea there's going to be some sort of conflict with two antagonists, and maybe it's over grazing rights or something. But then the more you start investigating, the more you think, well, actually maybe that I can still have this antagonism, but it can be based on something else factually and historically accurate based on the year and place that you've chosen. The action, so Peggy has asked where. Well, you've actually asked where I'm going. So I'm going to be traveling to a few different states, and I'll tell you in a second. But the action in the book is all taking place. It all takes place in Oregon, and so part of that was because we arranged to go and visit friends of ours who live in Texas, near Dallas. And so we're going there. And I know you're thinking, but that's miles from Oregon, so why on earth would you choose Oregon? So, of course, part of me thought, to start with, well, I can choose to write somewhere about Texas, which is perfect cowboy western tradition. But then our friends said, they're English, they've been living over there for a few years, obviously they've travelled around the States more than we have, but they said, you spend a few days with us in Dallas, in Texas, but how about we go and visit some other places in the States where we haven't visited, and my wife and I haven't visited either. And so after discussing places that we could go, that we would like to go, I said, well, I'm writing this book. I'm starting this book. This was months ago. So I'm starting this book. I want to set it on the Western frontier. And at that point, I was talking about like Arizona or maybe California. I thought, well, I could somewhere around there, New Mexico or something. And I thought, well, I could, wherever I choose, we can go there. But different reasons, when we were discussing things, we ended up deciding to go to the Pacific Northwest. So we're going to go up to Seattle and then go down into Oregon and then finish up in San Francisco and then travel back by plane, fly back to Dallas before we head back home. And so at that point, when we fixed on the location we were visiting, I then thought, okay, let me investigate whether I could set the story in Oregon, and so that I can actually go to at least close to the place that I'm setting the book in, even if it's not exactly, go to the same state at least. And so that's what we did. So in the end, I chose Oregon because we're going to be in Oregon. So, and again, this is one of those things through necessity. I wasn't planning on writing about Oregon. I didn't really know anything about it, but obviously once I'd set and I decided where the book was going to take place, I then started to do more research and things came up and different things came to light that I thought actually that serves the story well. And also it's slightly different. So I'm sure there's many books set in Oregon, many westerns, but it's definitely not as popular as Texas and New Mexico and Colorado and Arizona and whatever further south. So I thought maybe it's a slightly more original location, at least not as sort of stereotypical. And so we're going to spend a couple of days on a ranch in Oregon, hopefully do some horse riding and get to talk to the ranch hands. It's a working ranch. The family there are actually a family that originally went to Oregon on the Oregon Trail back in the 1870s or something. So it'll be fantastic and a fantastic experience, and it means that of course I can put it down as research, and hopefully, even though I finished the first draft of the book, part of that part of the idea of going to these places is that then when I come back I can add a smattering of extra detail and extra sort of magic on top, that will make it even better and more authentic, hopefully. So yeah, so that, in answer to your question, that's it. So Texas, so we're doing 4 states. We're doing Texas, Washington State, Oregon, and a bit of California as well. So it's going to be a real trip of a lifetime. I don't think I can afford to do it again. We've been looking at the prices and what we're having to what we're spending on hotels and stuff. I'm thinking, my God. Anyway, so hopefully this book sells. Make sure you buy the book so that we can eat next year. So this book won't be out until next summer, I think. I've not got the exact date, and I don't have a title for it yet either. I've got a working title, but the publishers are not convinced. So we will see what it ends up being called. They've got a copy of it now, so hopefully they'll come up with some sample titles. Any other questions from anyone? And thanks for the questions, everyone that's asked questions. It's really, really nice to have a bit of interaction. And it's been a pleasure having a little chat on a Friday afternoon. And always happens. I'll say goodbye, and just as I'm about to say goodbye, another message will pop up. Of course, if you're watching this after the event, the video will still be available online. And if you hear something I say, you want to ask a question about it, of course, you can drop a comment in, and I'll see them, and I'll pop in and answer them after this live session. So Chris Bailey, sounds like a great route, some wonderful country, I'd imagine. I always loved Meriwether Lewis's quote about not understanding why the Pacific was so named, as they hadn't seen one Pacific day since they arrived. Yeah, well, that's pretty much going to be like my book. There's definitely the idea of the book, this Englishman travelling away from his dark past and his troubled past, and he's looking for some peace. Of course, it doesn't end up great for him. But he has some experiences along the way. Peggy, when is the next Bearbrand book coming out? So I've got a new book coming out in February. In February? I don't know what date it is. No, in September. I've got a new book coming out in September, which is the sequel of A Night of Flames, and that's A Day of Reckoning, and that's the third in the A Time for Swords series. So that's Hunlaf, the monk. And basically, after this trip to America in a couple of weeks, I'm going to start work on the 10th Bearbrand book. So I haven't even started writing it yet. All I've got is a rough synopsis of 1,000 words or a couple of thousand words. But it's already agreed, it's already signed off with the publishers, so that will be happening. So book 10 of Bearbrand will be written between sort of October this year and, I don't know, May or something next year, March, April, May, and then handed in, probably published towards the end of 2024, I guess. My guess is it will be either just around sort of Christmas 2024 or January 25 or something like that. So in the meantime, you've got this A Day of Reckoning in September, this 19th century Western noir crime thriller thing, and that will be out sometime in the summer next year, 2024, and then there'll be the next Bearbrand. And after that, let's see, maybe there'll be a sequel to this 19th century book. Maybe there will be an 11th Bearbrand and a 4th Hunlaf and a 2nd Gabriel Stokes, who is the character in the Western. Before I go, one of the things that I did whilst I was researching for the Western is go and shoot some guns, find some people in the UK who shoot black powder cartridge weapons from the 19th century, and I just thought I'd show off. So I went to see some guys back in March shooting 1874 Sharps rifles, 45-70 caliber. So that's 45 caliber, 70 grains of gunpowder or black powder. That's a cartridge from one. That's the size of the bullet that comes out of that cartridge. So it'll be in like that. Pretty big. I think if you sort of put that next to my finger, it gives you an idea of the size of that thing. And that's chunky. And they were shoots. This is a lead alloy. He told me what, I can't remember, lead and something alloy. But anyway, this thing, they were shooting and pretty much pinpoint accuracy with these 1874 Sharps rifles at distances of 300 yards or 600 yards. They were doing target shooting, lying prone as if they were shooting buffalo, basically. So these are the sort of guns that would be used to shoot buffalo. So 600 yards, that's a bloody long way without a telescopic sight, and to be hitting within a couple of centimetres of what they were aiming for. I mean, amazing weapons and amazing marksmen. The guys that were doing that. There was a guy called Phil Morgan invited me along to that. And here's an anecdotal thing. Here's one of those, as we were talking when I was there, they said sometimes, I dropped it. They said sometimes the cartridges shear off in the barrel and break, and that's what happens when they do. And just as he said it, he said it's very rare. So it very rarely happens, but just as he said it, it happened. And to someone else's gun, there was other people there shooting, and they had to sort of get it out because it all stuck inside the barrel. But yeah, so Quigley's gun, Chris Chris Bailey says, Quigley Down Under, the film, it is the rifle, and in fact this guy Phil Morgan's rifle was built by the same guys who who manufactured the gun for the Quigley movie. And one of their competitions is, because they're all the guys fire these Sharps 1874 rifles, and one of their competitions is based on the bucket thing and from the film, so the distances and everything. They basically use stuff from the film to sort of do these target practice, because they've got these massively long ranges in Bisley, which is really interesting. They've got 1,000-yard ranges and stuff, and so the fact that these guns could shoot 150 years ago, and they could shoot 1,000 yards and still have stopping power at that distance, I mean, it's incredible. And so that was really interesting. And then a little bit later, I went to see some other guys shooting traditional weapons from the time period, not at such long ranges, but black powder as well. And I fired some different different revolvers and shotguns and a couple of types of Winchester rifles, and yeah, that was great as well. And it was really one of the things that I found really quite amazing, actually, firing the Winchester was, or the Winchesters, was how easy the action is on them. You know, you've got the lever action, the lever rifles, and the levers. I always sort of imagined that the lever would be quite difficult to eject the shell and sort of reload. But actually, it's incredibly smooth, and you don't have to drop the gun down at all. You can just keep it up your shoulder and just keep aiming, and fire off one after another. You know, a shot every second, or even faster if you're good at it. And incredibly accurately, and you can see how these guns, which were originally coming out in like the 1866, is the first repeater Winchester, but that's after a Henry rifle, which was similar, and then you've got the really famous 1873, which is very similar. But you these repeating rifles, which could take between 10 and 15 rounds. You could see why they basically are known as the guns that won the West. I mean, you suddenly arm people with these things, and it's incredible. The fact that you could just shoot round after round after round with amazing accuracy. And of course, you've got lots of the stories about things like in the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, I think it was. And the Sioux Indians that outnumbered Custer and the famous Custer's Last Stand, but Custer's cavalry were all armed with I think Spencer rifles, which were single shot rifles, and lots of the Sioux Indians had actually managed to get hold of these repeater Henrys and Winchester rifles, so they were coming in and they had 10-15 rounds in their guns, where the cavalry only had single shot rifles. So it's no wonder that they managed to finish them off and make mincemeat of them, really. Anyway, on that note, I've been talking for nearly an hour, and I'm sure I'll do some more live. It's been a while since I've done any of these live chats. I've been busy writing. It's difficult when you're actually head down in the books, actually writing, and then of course on top of that doing the podcast. I've mentioned it a couple of times, Rock Paper Swords, the podcast. So finding time for all of those things and everything else that comes along, like the edits that you've got to do on previous books and stuff. So it's difficult to find time to do these videos, but I really enjoy doing it. It's great, being able to interact directly with you guys, and I really appreciate your interest. And I hope that as we get further and further on the production process of this new novel, I'll talk a bit more about it, and hopefully there'll be interest enough that some people buy the book, and that my publishers and I don't regret spending the time working on it. But I think if you've enjoyed my other books, I think you'll enjoy it. I think essentially all of my books are westerns wrapped up in the Dark Ages or early medieval period, whereas this time I've just chosen to write a western set in the West of America. But really, the stories that I tell and the way that I tell them hasn't really changed very much. It doesn't really change. It's very similar, similar types of characters and similar types of conundrum that the characters have to face, and interactions and violent action as well. So hopefully it will hit the right spot with people and you'll enjoy it. And until then, thanks everybody for tuning in. And if you've still got a question, or if you're watching this later and got a question, drop it in the comments and I will definitely be back sometime over the next couple of days and I will answer your questions. So thanks a lot. Have a great weekend. Enjoy whatever book you're reading. And if you haven't done so already, pre-order A Day of Reckoning, the third of the A Time for Swords books. And if you want to get a signed copy from me, go to matthewharvey.com and you can pre-order a signed copy from me. And if you want to leave a little message for a dedication, I can do that, or just send it to you signed, but get it directly from me if you want. All right, thanks very much and have a great weekend. Bye.